They didn't just mock my letters, they made them morning announcements. Every Monday, for 3 years, I folded my feelings into cream-colored envelopes and slid them into Margaret's locker before anyone else arrived. I thought they were secret, thought she'd never know who wrote them, but by the 5th week, someone found one, and by the 6th, Daniel was standing at the front of the class, reciting it like it was open mic night. "Your smile is a quiet rebellion," he read aloud, voice dipped in sarcasm. The room erupted in laughter. I sat 3 rows away, silent, my ears burning while Margaret stared at the floor, biting back a smirk. That was the first time. After that, it became tradition. They'd wait for the newest letter, pass it around like candy, highlight metaphors, underline the words that exposed too much of me. Melissa called them emotional fan fiction. Daniel called me the school's tragic poet. Margaret, she never said anything, but she never stopped them. I kept writing. Not because I didn't feel humiliated, not because I had some twisted hope she'd fall for me. I wrote because those letters were the only place where I didn't stutter, where I didn't shrink. On paper, I was fearless. In real life, I was Michael, the quiet one, the easy target. One morning, I arrived early like usual, but as I approached her locker, it was already open. Margaret stood there, holding an envelope I hadn't even delivered yet. She had been waiting. Watching. She didn't even glance at me, just said, "New one today?" and turned, handing it straight to Melissa. That day, it made it to the intercom. The office aide, either bribed or clueless, read it aloud before morning announcements. Even when the sky forgets to be blue, you remind it how to shine. The school roared with laughter, and I sat through it all, unmoving. My words had become a circus. But I never stopped. I started, worded writing differently. Less romantic. More real. The metaphors darkened. I wrote about loneliness, about betrayal, about what it felt like to watch your heart become someone's entertainment. They read them anyway, laughed anyway, but something changed. Margaret started showing up early, alone, just standing by her locker when I passed. Sometimes she looked at me. Once, she even nodded. No words, just that. I thought maybe she was growing a conscience. Until the day I saw her hand a letter to Daniel herself. That night, I tore every draft I ever wrote and let them scatter across the floor like ashes. But my hands still wanted to write. So I picked up my pen, and I wrote one final letter. This one wasn't about love, it was about them. About how cruelty doesn't make you powerful, it makes you forgettable. How silence doesn't mean weakness. How every word they'd stolen would one day be remembered for something they never expected. I didn't leave it in her locker. I taped it to the door of the auditorium, and I signed my name. My name is Michael Saeed, and I was never supposed to be remembered. Not by them, not by her, not by the echoing classrooms or fluorescent lit corridors of Crestwood High. I was supposed to be a blur in the background of everyone else's high school story, the quiet boy in the back row, hoodie pulled up, notebook always open but never shared. But then I made the mistake of feeling something. And worse, I made the mistake of writing it down. It started with Margaret. She sat in front of me in chemistry, always 5 minutes early, always with the same peppermint lip gloss and a neat stack of flashcards she never actually used. She had a presence that demanded attention even when she wasn't speaking. It wasn't that she was the loudest or the most beautiful girl in school. It was that when Margaret laughed, people leaned in. When she walked into a room, conversations shifted around her like gravity. And I watched her. Not obsessively, not like the creeps who slid into her DMs or followed her through the halls pretending not to stare. I just noticed her, the way her eyes shifted to the windows when the lectures got too long, the way she hummed under her breath while writing notes, the way she looked lonely, even when surrounded by people. I wrote about that. The first letter wasn't even a letter. It was a paragraph I scribbled on the back of a pop quiz, folded in half, and tucked between 2 pages of her borrowed textbook when I returned it. I didn't sign it. I didn't expect anything, but I liked how it felt, sending something real into the world without needing to be seen. Then I wrote another. And another. By the 3rd week, the letters had become a ritual. Before first period, I'd slip a folded note into her locker, sometimes poetry, sometimes messy stream of consciousness ramblings, sometimes single lines like, "You look tired today, I hope the world lets you breathe." She never responded, not directly, but the letters kept disappearing. That was enough for me, until it wasn't. It was Daniel who first exposed me. He was the type who always needed an audience, captain of the basketball team, head of the student council, and a loud, golden boy who made everyone feel like extras in his show. Daniel thrived on attention, and one day, he caught me slipping a letter into Margaret's locker. I didn't know until lunch. The moment I walked into the cafeteria, I knew something was wrong. A hush followed me like smoke, whispers, stifled laughter, and then, from the far table, Daniel stood on a chair, waving a sheet of paper like a victory flag. "Let me introduce you all," he said loudly, "to Crestwood's very own secret admirer. This gem was found in Margaret's locker just this morning." I froze, and then he read it, out loud. Every word, every line I wrote in earnest was turned into a joke, a performance, background noise for other people's lunch. I thought Margaret would be furious, embarrassed, maybe even angry enough to shut him down. But she laughed, not cruelly, not viciously, just lightly, like it didn't mean anything. Melissa, her best friend, leaned across the table and snatched the letter from Daniel's hand. "Wow," she said. "This is kind of intense. You are the gravity that tethers me to days I would otherwise float through alone." She looked at Margaret and smirked. "Romantic or creepy?" "Creepy," Margaret answered. But she was smiling. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, my chest hollowed out, wondering if I'd ever been seen at all or just mistaken for someone they could laugh at safely. But even then, I didn't stop writing. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't revenge, it was habit, therapy. The only way I knew how to speak without stammering. And deep down, I thought maybe she didn't really know it was me. Maybe that's why she laughed, because it was easier to make fun of a stranger. But I was wrong. 2 weeks later, during an after-school study session in the library, Margaret walked past my table. She didn't stop, didn't say anything, just brushed by, then paused, turned around, and whispered, "You shouldn't write things you're not brave enough to claim." Then she walked away. My throat tightened, my fingers trembled around my pen. She knew, she had known. The next morning, another letter I never sent was taped to my locker. This one was different. Someone had scribbled over it in red marker, "Go write for the school paper, freak." I didn't write anything for 2 weeks after that, not for her, not for myself. And in that silence, something strange happened. I began to see Margaret differently. She was still magnetic, still composed, but the more I watched, the more cracks I found in her glass. She snapped at Melissa during a group project, avoided eye contact with Daniel when he teased her about prom. She stopped laughing when my name came up, and sometimes, just sometimes, she lingered near my locker too long to be accidental. Margaret wasn't just cruel, she was lost, or maybe just tired of being adored for things she didn't choose. That didn't excuse what she did, but it made her human. By senior year, the narrative changed. I wasn't just the ghostwriter, I was the myth. Rumors swirled about the letter guy, girls joked about getting one next, a few even asked me to write for them. I never said yes, not because I thought I was better, but because those words weren't transferable, they belonged to a version of Margaret I could never fully hold. And then came the morning when I found Daniel reading one of my letters over the school intercom. This one hadn't been left in a locker. It had been taken from my bag. It wasn't a love letter, it was raw, honest, angry. I'd written it after seeing Margaret hand one of my notes to Melissa with a careless flick of her fingers. "You don't read to understand," I had written. "You read to shred, but paper bleeds quiet." They laughed at that too. But later that day, Margaret didn't look amused. She looked uneasy. After class, she stopped me in the hallway for the first time in 2 years. "I didn't give him that letter," she said quietly. I didn't answer. "I'm sorry," she added. That was the first time I realized Margaret could be sorry. That guilt could bloom in a girl who spent years smiling through someone else's humiliation. I walked away without replying. But that night, I wrote again, and for the first time, I signed it with my full name. Michael Saeed. No initials, no hiding, just the truth. It should have ended with that signature. My name was out there now, no more anonymity, no more mystery. I thought signing the letter would end the game, but it did the opposite, it changed the stakes. The next morning, my locker wasn't just crowded, it was surrounded. Students stood in a half-circle, staring at the sheet of paper taped right in the middle. One of my letters, but not one I had delivered, Not one I had given to Margaret or even intended to finish. It was a draft, unfinished, unedited, incomplete, and signed, Michael Saeed. At the bottom, someone had scrawled, "So this is the guy? 3 years of this pathetic sappy garbage?" I tore it down with shaking hands, my knuckles whitening with the pressure. A few people backed off, others laughed under their breath. Melissa stood at a distance, arms folded, eyes sharp. She didn't say a word, but Margaret wasn't there. She was nowhere. Until third period. I found her at her desk, headphones in, pretending not to notice the whispers. I slipped into the seat behind her. The teacher hadn't arrived yet. "You gave someone that draft?" I asked, my voice low. She paused her music but didn't turn around. "I didn't." "Then who did?" Silence. My throat dried. I pushed the folded remains of the page onto her desk. This was in my notebook, in my backpack. Someone took it. Finally, she looked at me. Her eyes didn't flinch. "Do you think I'd break into your bag, Michael? I think you've let worse happen." A flicker of something crossed her face. Guilt? Anger? I couldn't tell. "I don't owe you anything," she said coldly. "I didn't ask for your letters." "No," I replied. "You just read them out loud, laughed with them, let them turn me into a punchline." She turned back in her seat. I'm not the only one who laughed. The class started, but I didn't hear a word. Not because I was angry, though I was, but because somewhere in the pit of my chest, I felt stupid for ever believing her eyes might have been honest when she said sorry. The next few days blurred. Daniel upped the campaign. Every time he passed me in the hallway, he'd clutch his chest dramatically. "Dear Margaret, you are the ink to my otherwise empty soul." The halls would fill with snickers. Melissa started posting screenshots, photos of the letters Margaret had taken over the years. She didn't blur my name. They went viral within the school. Crestwood's little poet. I stopped writing, stopped sitting in the library. I ate lunch in an empty art room, behind the easel racks. It didn't matter, the whispers followed. My name had never mattered so much, and yet never felt more disposable. But what cracked me open was the discovery that one of the letters, my most private one, had never made it to Margaret at all. It was one I wrote during a particularly heavy week. The week I'd learned my parents were separating. I'd written about not believing in happy endings, about thinking some people only exist to witness the love others get. It was raw, real. I had never even sealed it. I left it in the back of my notebook because I wasn't ready to part with it, but Melissa posted it, every word, online. Captioned, "Margaret, you've got a stalker with daddy issues." That's when I stopped going to school for a week. When I returned, people had moved on. Something new was trending. Some senior prank or a teacher caught dating a college student. The noise had shifted. But I hadn't. I walked through halls in silence, ignoring every sideways glance, until someone tapped my shoulder during break. "Margaret. You weren't here last week." "Nope." Her voice lowered. "Melissa shouldn't have posted that letter." I raised an eyebrow. "But you read it." "I didn't know what it was. I didn't think she'd." "You gave her everything." She looked away. I added, "And now you're what? Regretful?" "I didn't come to argue." "Then what did you come for?" She bit her lip, hesitating. "Daniel told her that you left your bag unzipped in the cafeteria. She didn't break in, he did." I blinked. "So she just posted it. That makes it better?" "No," she whispered. "It makes it worse, I know that." I couldn't look at her, not because she wasn't sorry, but because her apology arrived too late, dragging behind it 1,000 echoes of my humiliation. She added, almost too quietly, "I didn't laugh this time. And that's supposed to matter?" She looked up at me then. "Yes, to me, it does." That should have been the end of the conversation, but it wasn't. The next day, I found another paper in my locker. It wasn't mine. It was a page torn from Margaret's notebook, in her handwriting. "I found your first letter yesterday, the one you left in my textbook sophomore year. I kept it, and I didn't laugh." There was more. She'd written a reply, 3 years too late. "I wasn't ready to understand your words then. I was too busy being adored, but you didn't write to adore me. You wrote like you saw the parts of me I didn't want anyone to notice, and that scared me." I sat there, staring at the page, feeling my ribs teague. 10. And then I found a second letter, then a third. For every letter I'd sent her, she'd written a mirror. Some were apologies, some were explanations, some were quiet memories, her loneliness, her self-doubt, her guilt, her shame. It was intimate, unfiltered, but she didn't send them to me directly, Melissa did. Or more specifically, Melissa handed me a sealed folder the next day in class, without a word. Inside it were the letters, each one dated, some years old. I stared at Melissa. She didn't blink. "You wanted truth," she said. "There it is." I asked, "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I read them," she said. And I didn't laugh. And for the first time, I saw something behind Melissa's cold perfection: fatigue, resentment, regret. "You both used me," I said. "Yeah," she nodded. "We did." And then she added, "But that doesn't mean you were wrong. You wrote things people don't have the guts to say out loud. That scares them. It scared me." "Why now?" I asked. "Why give them to me?" She smirked, sad and sharp. "Because Margaret's trying to say something she doesn't know how to speak. And because Daniel doesn't speak for us anymore." The hallway bell rang, students shifted around us like the wind, but I stood still, holding the words Margaret had never sent. And I suddenly didn't feel mocked. I felt like a weapon they could no longer use. And I was done being silent. I used to think heartbreak was loud, explosive, a cinematic breakdown beneath the rain. But it's not. It's the quiet sound of paper tearing in your hands. It's walking through school corridors, realizing everyone's already read your heart before you even had a chance to explain it. It's knowing that no matter how carefully you choose your words, someone else will rewrite them into a joke. And yet I still wrote. I wrote while they laughed, I wrote while Margaret looked away, I wrote while Daniel stood on chairs, mocking my metaphors like they were bad punchlines. And I told myself, every single time, that writing it down was better than keeping it inside. But no one tells you what happens when the words you bled are thrown back at you like rotten fruit. It's not just humiliation, it's exposure. It's knowing you stood naked in a crowd, and no one cared enough to look away. There were days I convinced myself Margaret didn't know, that she was just caught in the middle, that Melissa was the one pulling the strings, and Daniel the one turning the wheel. But the truth sat in the way she smiled during those readings. It lay in her silence, her refusal to defend me when it would have cost her nothing. I wasn't just invisible to her. I was disposable. Even when she apologized, I didn't know how to accept it. What would it change? The damage was done. The words weren't just violated, they were archived, reposted, printed, shared. It was as if every time I tried to heal, another copy of the pain resurfaced somewhere else. That kind of betrayal doesn't bleed, it bruises, slow and deep, in places no one sees. I tried to tell myself I was over it, that I didn't care anymore, that their opinions didn't matter, but then I'd hear someone whisper my name in class, and my hands would start shaking. I'd walk into a room and feel the pressure of invisible spotlights. I'd open my locker and lynch expecting another note that didn't belong to me. Every part of school became a minefield, and every glance from Margaret felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. The suspense wasn't in whether people still laughed, it was in not knowing who still remembered, who still had screenshots, who still saw me as the joke instead of the boy behind the ink. And what hurt more than anything was that writing used to be mine. It was the only place I felt control, the only thing that belonged to me without compromise. But now, every sentence I wrote came with hesitation. Every metaphor I thought of, I'd second guess. Would this be funny to them? Would they tear this apart too? Would this become next week's meme? They hadn't just stolen my dignity, they'd infected my process. And yet, I still wrote. I don't know if that makes me weak or stubborn. Maybe both. Maybe I was waiting for someone to understand me through those letters the way I understood Margaret. I watched her from a distance, yes, but I saw her, not the perfection, not the public mask. I saw the way her shoulders sagged when no one was looking, the way she hesitated before answering certain questions, the way she kept people close but never too close. Margaret wasn't as invincible as everyone thought. But that didn't make her innocent. Even if Melissa orchestrated the public mockery, even if Daniel performed the cruelty, Margaret had the power to stop it. And she didn't. She watched it happen, repeatedly, for years. And the worst part is, she knew it was me, she always knew. She once said I shouldn't write what I wasn't brave enough to claim. But wasn't she just as afraid? Afraid to break the script, afraid to lose her status, afraid to stand up and say, "This boy you're laughing at, he's real." I think that's what hurt the most. Not the laughter, not the exposure, but the quietness of someone I cared about refusing to say, "Enough." So when Melissa handed me that folder, Margaret's replies, her letters never sent, I didn't know how to feel. My first reaction was disbelief, then anger, then confusion. Because in those pages were things I never expected from her. Regret, honesty, sadness. She wrote like someone unraveling. She admitted she mocked me to feel less mocked herself. She wrote that she kept the first letter because no one had ever written to her like that before. Not even Daniel. Not even the boys who sent her flowers or tagged her in cheesy Instagram captions. Those letters, she wrote, were the first time someone described her without expectations. And she didn't know what to do with that. I sat in my room that night, surrounded by her letters, feeling like I was living someone else's story. Because the girl I'd watched all those years, the untouchable, unbothered Margaret, wasn't who wrote these. This was someone else, someone who cried in bathrooms between classes, someone who felt like a placeholder in her own relationships. Someone who had been just as lonely as me. But was it enough? Could years of humiliation be undone by a few honest pages? Was I supposed to feel grateful that she finally saw me? Or was this just another chapter in a long line of manipulation? And what about Melissa? Why had she handed them over? Was it guilt? Was it her way of backing out before everything imploded? I didn't know. And I hated not knowing. Because every time I started to soften, I remembered the sound of Daniel's voice imitating my words, I remembered Margaret's laughter, I remembered sitting in the library stall, hiding behind books, ending, I wasn't wiping my eyes. And still, I kept the letters. I read them more than once. Because even if they were late, even if they were imperfect, they were the closest thing to truth I'd ever received from her, and in a world that never gave me closure, maybe that counted for something. But I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, not when the story wasn't finished, because something was building. A shift. Margaret had stopped laughing, Melissa had stopped posting, and Daniel was losing his grip. There was something in the air. The suspense wasn't whether I'd be mocked again, it was what I was going to do next. And for once, the script wasn't theirs to write anymore. It started with an announcement no one expected. Crestwood's Literature Showcase was returning after 4 years. A school-wide event where selected students would read original pieces on stage before peers, parents, faculty, and press. Essays, monologues, poems, anything written from the heart. The notice board said, "Submissions open, anonymous entries allowed, top 5 get invited to perform." I didn't plan on entering. Not after everything. But then Melissa cornered me outside the library. "You should submit," she said plainly. I stared at her. "Why? So you can watch it burn live this time?" She didn't even flinch. "Because Margaret submitted something." I paused. "What?" Melissa shifted her bag higher on her shoulder. "A response. Not just to the letters, to everything, to you." I didn't believe her, not at first, but then she pulled out her phone, showing me a photo, the title on the screen, "To the Boy Who Wrote When No One Listened." "She's not trying to save face," Melissa said. "She's trying to speak, in her own voice, finally." I walked away without answering. But the seed was planted. For the first time, Margaret wasn't reacting, she was initiating. That night, I pulled out every letter I never finished. Fragments, pages I'd torn out mid-thought, pieces I never dared send because they felt too raw, too unpolished, too real. One in particular stuck out. It wasn't about Margaret, it was about me, about what it felt like to be everyone's afterthought. I edited for hours. By morning, it was done. I dropped it in the submission box without a name. I wasn't expecting anything. But 3 days later, I got the email. "Your piece has been selected as a finalist," so had Margaret's. And Daniel's. That part, no one expected. Apparently, he had submitted a satire piece titled, "Love Letters from a Loser." When I saw the lineup, I almost withdrew, but something in me wouldn't allow it. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe pride, maybe the need to finally reclaim what had always been mine. The night of the showcase, the auditorium was packed. I sat in the wings, waiting my turn, heartbeat pulsing in my throat. Melissa sat 2 rows behind Margaret in the crowd. Daniel leaned against the curtain backstage, smug, rehearsing. Margaret stood in a long navy coat, holding nothing but a folded paper in her hand. She looked calm, but I could see the shake in her fingers. Daniel was called first. His piece opened with, "Dear Crush, I saw you yesterday and almost died. Not because you're beautiful, but because you exist, and I wasn't ready for that kind of tragedy." Laughter erupted. He exaggerated his voice, mimicking me, mocking me. I sat frozen. Until he said, "And even though your silence cuts deeper than my dad's absence, just know, I'll keep writing, because emotional constipation is my aesthetic now." A few students laughed so hard they clapped. The MC thanked him. He bowed, he winked in my direction. It was supposed to be funny, it was designed to make me walk out. I didn't. Margaret went next. The room quieted, no music, no theatrics, just her voice. I used to laugh, not because I thought it was funny, but because I didn't know how to stop. Because when someone hands you love like an exposed wound and you're still learning how to hold your own scars, it's easier to flinch than to feel. The room froze. She continued. "For 3 years, I read his letters, all of them, the ones that called me Starlight, the ones that asked why I looked sad near the vending machine, the ones I pretended not to understand because understanding meant confronting myself. Every word was quiet, but it echoed. And yes, I laughed. Because I was afraid. Because everyone else was watching. Because Daniel needed an audience, and I didn't want to be next." She looked up then, eyes sweeping across the rows. "I don't know if apologies can reverse time, but this is me, finally holding the mirror up to my own cruelty, not for forgiveness, but for truth." Silence. Some people clapped, some didn't know how to. Then came my turn. I stood, letter in hand. Took a breath. I used to write love letters because it was the only way I felt heard. A pause. Then people turned my voice into wallpaper, and when that wasn't loud enough, they turned it into theater, laughter, hashtags, announcements. I didn't look at Daniel, I didn't need to. But I didn't stop. Because sometimes, when the world ignores you long enough, you learn how to whisper until your whisper carries weight. The crowd was still. I wrote for a girl who smiled like thunder and hurt like silence. I wrote because I didn't know how else to say, "You matter," even when I didn't. I looked toward the crowd. I saw Margaret. She wasn't crying. But her hands were clenched white in her lap. I'm not here to be pitied or applauded. I'm just here to take back my voice, because it was always mine. Applause started slow, then it grew, louder than I'd ever heard in that auditorium. And when I stepped off stage, Margaret was already waiting backstage. She held out a letter. Handwritten. "This one, I want you to have. Not Melissa, not a crowd, just you." I took it. She started to walk away, but I called after her. "Why now?" She paused. "Because I finally understand that silence is not neutral, and letting people humiliate someone who sees you, that's a kind of violence." I unfolded the paper. Inside, just one line. "I never meant to be the villain in your story, but maybe I can help you rewrite the ending." For days after the showcase, things at Crestwood felt different. Not fixed, not perfect, just quieter. The way the halls fell silent when I walked through them, gone. The mocking glances, the poorly hidden smirks, the whispers behind lockers, they'd faded into something else. Not respect, not quite remorse either, just recognition. I wasn't invisible anymore, but I wasn't infamous either. I was something in between. A few students I barely knew came up to me. One girl from sophomore year math said, "I used to write poetry too, but stopped after someone laughed." A junior I didn't recognize said, "You said some real stuff, man, about being heard, thanks." But I didn't care about the attention. I cared about what happened next. Because Daniel wasn't done. At first, he stayed quiet after the showcase. He'd lost the crowd, he knew it. No one reposted his performance, no one quoted him in the halls. In fact, someone painted over the locker graffiti he once laughed at. But power doesn't like silence. A week later, the storm hit. Someone leaked screenshots, old messages, private DMs between Daniel and Melissa, snippets of conversations where he discussed stealing my letters, forwarding them to group chats, planning how to accidentally get them read aloud. At first it seemed like gossip. Then came the video. A saved recording from 3 years ago, Daniel in the cafeteria, holding one of my letters. Reading it into a friend's phone, doing different voice imitations. This part's gold. Listen, your laugh bends time. What the hell does that even mean? In the background, you could hear Margaret's voice. Daniel, stop, don't post that. But he did. And now it had resurfaced. By noon, it was everywhere. I sat in the library when Melissa found me. She tossed a USB drive onto the desk. I leaked it, she said flatly. I blinked. Why? Because I should have done it years ago, Bu. 'Cause it wasn't fair to let you carry all the shame while he walked free. I stared at her. Melissa had always been complex, elegant, sharp-tongued, unapologetically blunt, but this was something else. He deserved it, she added. You didn't. What changed? She hesitated, folding her arms. You did, she said. You stopped being quiet, and that made me realize I've been quiet in the worst ways. And she left. The fallout was instant. Teachers got involved. The principal called in both Daniel and me. He sat across from me, arms crossed, jaw tight. They asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint. The word bullying came up, so did harassment. They offered mediation, disciplinary action, suspension options. But I said no. I just wanted him to say it. You took my words, I said, facing him across the conference table. You took them and spit on them in front of 100 people, 3 years in a row. Daniel didn't meet my eyes. I leaned forward. Just say it. Admit you did it. Silence. The principal cleared her throat. Daniel? He finally looked up. Fine, he muttered. Yeah, I did. It should have felt victorious, but it didn't. It felt hollow. Why? I asked. He laughed bitterly. Because you were easy. I blinked. You sat in the back, never talked, wrote sad boy stuff like it was Shakespeare. It pissed me off, okay? I hated how everyone looked at your letters like they were sacred, so I ruined it. You mean you hated that people saw me? He said nothing. I turned to the principal. I don't want punishment, I want space, just keep him away from me. She nodded, meeting over. As we left, Daniel caught my arm. I didn't hate your letters, he said quietly. I hated that they weren't about me. I froze. He released me, and walked off. I stood there for a while, stunned. Later that night, I got a call. It was Margaret. I saw the video, she said. I'm sorry. You've said that before. I know, but this time, I mean it differently. There was silence on the line, then she added, Can we meet? I hesitated. Where? She named the park behind the school, midnight, where the school fence broke and the sky opened wider than anywhere else in town. I went. She was already there, sitting on the swings, her coat drawn tight around her. You came, she said, softly. I almost didn't. I would have waited anyway. I stood in front of her. Why here? Because it's where I used to go after the letters were read out loud, she said. After I laughed with them. I always came here after school to reread them, alone. That caught me off guard. You reread them? She nodded. All of them. Even the ones I never gave to Melissa. I sat beside her. The wind tugged softly at our jackets. I was cruel, she said, but not just to you, to myself too, because I was scared of how much your words saw me. I didn't say anything. And when you stopped writing, it felt like losing air. I looked at her, eyes steady. Then why let them use me like that? Because being adored felt safer than being known. Her voice broke slightly. And your letters didn't adore me, they knew me, they touched places I hadn't touched myself, so I panicked. A pause. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say that. We sat in silence for a long time. Then I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out a letter, folded, unsealed. Wrote this yesterday, I said. Didn't know if I'd give it to you. She took it, hands trembling. Opened it, read silently. Tears welled in her eyes. I wish I had read this 3 years ago. I wish I had written it sooner. She looked at me. I miss who I was in your letters. I smiled faintly. She's still in there, just quieter now. Margaret reached out, her hand brushing mine. I don't want to be a metaphor anymore, she whispered. I just want to be real. You always were. We sat there, swing chains creaking gently, stars scattered above us like secrets waiting to be said. And for the first time since I wrote that very first letter, I didn't feel invisible. I felt understood. By the time the final week of school arrived, the echoes had quieted. Not just around me, but everywhere. Daniel no longer held the center of the hallway like a throne. Melissa, once the sharp voice behind every caption, had deactivated her social media completely. And Margaret had started walking through the school like she didn't owe anyone anything. Not even forgiveness. The letters, my letters, had become more than rumor. They'd become part of Crestwood's silent archive. Even the teachers knew. One of them, Mr. Keller, patted my shoulder as I submitted my final assignment and said, "You wrote your way through hell, son, that matters." But what mattered more was what came after. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since the mediation meeting, not really, and I had no intention to. But revenge doesn't always come in the form of confrontation. Sometimes it comes from letting your silence weigh more than their noise ever did. And then the perfect opportunity arrived. The student-run yearbook club was releasing its first ever Voices of Crestwood edition, a printed supplement with chosen essays, monologues, and reflections submitted anonymously by students. Each piece would be attached to a portrait, names optional. I submitted 3. One of them was an old letter. One was my final stage piece from the literature showcase. And the third? It was a transcript of Daniel's video, verbatim. Every joke, every exaggerated line, every cruelty. Submitted as satire by an anonymous contributor on how to kill emotion. I didn't include his name, I didn't need to. The editors loved it. They didn't know it was real. But when it printed, and every senior received a copy with graduation gowns, Daniel's face paled at the sight of it. Everyone read it like it was fiction, commentary, art. They quoted it ironically, highlighted the worst lines. Bro, this is brutal. Whoever wrote this meme must have been in a dark place. Damn, this is what we sounded like? Daniel didn't speak, didn't defend, didn't even glance at me in the ceremony lineup. And that silence, that was closure. The day of graduation, I wore a deep navy suit under my gown and stood with Margaret outside the school building, waiting for the photo groups to form. She held her cap in her hand, sunlight catching her hair, soft wind moving between us. Remember when you said I always looked calm? She asked. I smiled. Yeah. I'm not calm today. Why not? She looked at me. Because I'm afraid the second we step out of this building, we'll stop being who we became. I understood what she meant. In here, we had a story, a journey, a redemption arc. But the real world didn't hand out bullet comments or spotlight confessions. Out there, we were just graduates, just people. You're wrong, I said quietly. You'll still be Margaret, just not the version who needed to laugh to survive. And you? I adjusted my tassel. I'll still write, but this time, not because no one listens, but because I want to say something. A voice called for our row. We started to walk. I stopped. Wait. Margaret turned. I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out a letter. Different envelope, thicker paper, gold-edged. I wrote you one more. She smiled. Old habits. Closure. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single page, only one sentence. Thank you for being the lesson that turned into something more than regret. Her eyes shimmered. Can I respond? I shrugged. Graduation's almost over. She tucked the letter into her gown. I'll find you. The ceremony began. Names were called, caps flew, photos snapped. And afterward, people scattered like dust from a shaken book. But not all of them. I stood by the school gate, diploma in one hand, sunlight bleeding through the trees. Margaret approached, a folded paper in hers. "No more anonymous notes," she said. "This one's signed." She pressed it into my palm. Then leaned in. "I meant it when I said I'd find you." And she walked away, shoulders relaxed, head high, like someone who finally recognized herself again. I looked at the note. It read, "You once gave me a voice when I didn't deserve one, now I'll spend years trying to earn it. Signed, Margaret." I never thought I'd love a signature more than the words above it. As I turned to leave, Melissa called out from behind the front steps. "You actually made it out alive." I smirked. "Surprised?" She shook her head. "No. But proud?" "Yeah." She walked over, handed me a thin leather notebook. "This is for new letters, real ones, not the kind that hide." I took it. "Will you write too?" I asked. She gave me a sideways smile. "Already started." Daniel passed us in the distance, walking alone. No friends, no phone out, just quiet footsteps. The crowd didn't notice, but I did. I didn't feel pity or triumph, just balance. For once, the scales felt even. Crestwood shrank behind me as I walked away. My bag was heavier than usual, but not from regret, from letters, from stories, from pages that finally had meaning again, and this time they belonged to me, not to Margaret, not to the crowd, not to the noise, to me, because revenge wasn't in humiliation. It was in recovery, in silence reclaimed, in dignity restored. They mocked my love letters for 3 years, but today, they read them, out loud, to apologize.